early part of 1941, the Philippine Islands were thought to be one of the safest places in the world to be. Few people ever thought that the war would ever reach the islands. In December 1941, war clouds hung heavily over the islands. 2 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Japanese invaded the Philippines. On January 2, 1942, the Japanese military order was sent out for all American and Allied civilians to surrender to the Japanese authorities. Over 6,000 American and Allied civilians were captured and taken to civilian prisoner of war camps, where they spent the next 37 months. They were crowded into Santo Tomas and Los Baños university campuses. These camps became organized cities of internees. Life continued as best as could be done under the severe and crowded conditions. Food was in short supply from the beginning and was a main concern for everyone. The Japanese military provided very little for their captives. If it had not been for the loyalness and generosity of the Filipino people, bringing food and supplies to the internees, many would have starved. On February 3, 1945, an American plane flew over Santo Tomas camp, dropping a pilot's goggle case with a note that read, "Roll out the barrel, there's going to be a hot time in the old town tonight." After crashing through the main gates of Santo Tomas, the two American tanks, the Georgia Peach and the Battling Basics, made their way to the main building with combat soldiers following behind them. The camp was shelled for several days by the Japanese soldiers on the outside of the camp. Many internees lost their lives after the liberation due to the shelling. On February 23, 1945, the 11th Airborne Paratroopers made a daring rescue of the civilian prisoners from the internment camp at Los Baños, freeing over 800 internees from death by starvation. The following are some of their stories.
Hi, I'm Gertrude Stewart, and I live in Pasay City, where I are 3 years of Japanese imprisonment or internment during the war. But before the war here in Manila, it was a very, very different city from what it is today. It was a city of about 600,000 instead of being one of 10 million. And it was a virtual paradise. We had all the beautiful things that anybody could want. Our water system was excellent, our telephone system was excellent, our power system was excellent, unlike today. The security was fine. We slept with our doors open and our windows open. We didn't have high walls and high fences around our house. We could go walking on any street, any time of the night. It was really a very, very lovely, peaceful life. Until the Japanese started to act up. Then, of course, things got different. Now, a lot of people talk about the fact that it was a surprise attack by the Japanese when they came into Pearl Harbor, but I say it wasn't a surprise attack. It just came sooner than expected. In July of 1941, the State Department sent home all their dependents. Their wives and children were all sent home. So they expected something, obviously. And in July of 1941, my husband told me, "You go and get your passport renewed and get our son's son put on it too, so that you can go to the United States." So I refused to go, of course. I said, "No, if it's safe enough for you, it's safe enough for me, and I'm going to stay put." Everybody's attitude was that if the Japanese did come, it wasn't going to last long anyway. I'm hearing the same kind of talk today. You know, we are invincible sort of thing, which we're not. Nobody is invincible. But anyway, the Japanese, according to them, couldn't see properly, their planes wouldn't fly properly, and it would all be over in 2 or 3 weeks. But the time came, and they did take over the Philippines. But when they came into Manila, which was New Year's Day, if I remember correctly, or it might have been the 2nd of January, all I know is that we went out New Year's Eve to the Manila Hotel, and it was a very dreary place. There probably were about 15 couples in all, because we probably figured it was the last time we'd be going out for a while. And it was the next day or the day after that the Japanese came into Manila, because we knew they were on their way, coming in from the south. I don't remember exactly what day it was that they came to my home. We were in constant telephone contact with my mother and my sister and my brother. Not with my father, because my father had volunteered to join the army, and he was with the Engineer Corps and was in Bataan at that time. Oh, well, actually, he was in the forces that were retreating and blowing up bridges and that sort of thing on the way north. When the Japanese did come to my house, all through this whole experience, I figured that I had good luck following me. They had a man come to my house and tell us that we should come with them, and I, being naive and young and foolish, told him that we couldn't come at that time. He'd have to come back later, because we hadn't eaten yet. Well, that sounded like a reasonable reason to him. I explained to him that we only ate twice a day because of the brownouts or blackouts, and to please come back later. So he said, okay, how long? And I said, about an hour. So he came back an hour later. And at that time, I asked him if I could leave our little boy at home. Our little boy was 23 months old, and we were living in a compound of 3 houses. The other house, one of the houses, lived in by an American family, a professor from the University of the Philippines with his wife and daughter. And the third house was the owner, and he was a German originally with his wife and 3 sons. But they were Filipino citizens. And I had lived in the house since before the baby was born, and they loved him very dearly, and I knew that they would take care of him. I had no idea what was to happen to us. I didn't know whether they were going to throw us into jail, hang us, shoot us, or what they were going to do, and I felt that my son would be safer staying at home under the care of his ama or yaya or whatever one wants to call it, his nursemaid, who was married to our houseboy, and my German landlord and his wife. So I begged him to please let me leave my child at home, which he agreed to do if the lieutenant in charge would allow it. So I said to please go ask the lieutenant. So he came back a little bit later, and the lieutenant said that he couldn't do that because I might cry. I said, you go back, tell the lieutenant I promise I won't cry. So they allowed me to leave my son behind. And off we went. And we were lucky because we went to Santo Tomas internment camp. We were not taken to Villamor Hall first, where many people were taken, where there were no facilities of any kind, and it was a very sad situation. So we went directly to the internment camp. When we got to the internment camp, the Japanese told us to line up, the women on one side, men on the other, Americans over here, British over there. And then I was in a quandary because I'm American, my husband was British, and I didn't know what would be the best thing to do. Whether I should stay over on the American side or stay over on the British side. So I went over on the British side to be with my husband. I figured that was more important at the moment. So then they said, any woman who has a child, line up over there. Well, I had a child, but I didn't have him with me. And I said, I have a child, but he's not with me. Where do you want me to go? And they said, all people with children over there. So over there I went. And that night, we were put in an auxiliary building, which had been the home economics building before. And they were all women with children, except for 3 of us who, like myself, had children but not with them. And we were given the middle of the room. Everybody else had the outside edges where they could hang up mosquito nets and so on. And I'm telling you, those 3 nights, those first 3 nights I had in there were just awful, unbelievable. The toilet, the one toilet in the building, got clogged up within 2 hours or 3 hours of our arrival. Many of the women, of course, because they had young babies, had chamber pots. And all night long, you could hear them taking the cover off the chamber pot and using it. And somebody would get up. It's dark, mind you. There are no lights. They'd kick over a pot, and this stuff would pour all over the floor. And we in the middle of the room were lying in the midst of it. We were stinking wet with it. People would fall over us as they tried to go out. It was just dreadful. But after 3 days, we managed to get ourselves moved to rooms where there were no infants. Once I got into the main building where there were just women and no children, I was a good deal more comfortable. We had no bedding. Those first 3 nights I slept on the concrete floor, no pillow, no sheet, no cover. It was January, it was cold, and the mosquitoes were hungry. There hadn't been any students around for a while to eat from, so they had a feast. Once I got in the main building, by that time we'd made contact with the outside, and we were able to get mosquito net and some bedding in. And well, in the beginning also, there was no food being distributed anywhere. We were very hungry. And the food situation was such that I remember somebody gave me a hard-boiled egg. It was a hard-boiled duck egg. And they said, would you like to have this? It's more than we need. I said, thank you. I peeled it. It seemed a little bit slimy, but I thought, oh, well, that's because it's a duck egg. And I washed it and chopped it up and used it as a sandwich spread. I had a little piece of onion. I don't know where I got it. And I made a sandwich spread. And my sister, my mother, my husband, myself all had some. My brother doesn't like egg sandwiches, and he didn't eat any. The 4 of us became deathly ill with food poisoning, and we almost lost my mother. She had to have her stomach pumped. It was really a very hungry time, those first few days, until we had made contacts with the outside. There were people in there who, unlike ourselves, who had contacts outside. There were people who had come down from Shanghai. They were refugees from Shanghai, who had no contacts here at all. There were mariners, people off the ships, sailors of all ages, who had no contacts here. Sometimes they didn't even have a shipping company contact. And those poor people had no food at all. And that lasted for quite a long time before the Red Cross got sufficiently organized with the Japanese, because the Japanese didn't feed us, and the Red Cross didn't feed us, and a few people, of course, got some water that was, I don't mean water, food that was brought in, and they were able to eat. We ourselves made arrangements for our help to bring food to us every day. My husband had some money with him, and he borrowed money from someone or other, I don't know whom, to pay for supplies. Then after a few months, when I say after a few months, in early April, the Japanese decided that they were going to let the aged, the sick, and the mothers with young children stay outside or go outside. Some of the aged and the sick were already outside and had never been brought in. Oh, people like myself, my little boy was outside already, and they allowed me to go out. They told us that we would have to go out the first day of May. They wouldn't allow us out. Although it had been approved, they didn't want us to go out until after April 29th, because that was the emperor's birthday, and they were afraid that the Japanese soldiers might get drunk and go berserk. So they didn't want us out until after that, which was probably good, very good thing. So I lived outside in my home. Now, I had no money, so the first thing I did was to sell a piece of my husband's workshop machinery that I had given him for Christmas, the Christmas before, a wood turning machine, and I sold it for 50 pesos. And I decided, well, now I've got to do something to earn money in order to support this family. My husband can't do it from inside. So I sat and talked to myself for a couple of hours to try to figure out what in the world could I do. And I know that one or two of the other women were making things like cakes and muffins and so on. But I figured that inasmuch as wheat was imported, that wasn't going to be able to continue for a while. But I know the Philippines produces sugar and will always produce sugar, and so I'm going to do something with sugar, and that means candy. So I started making candy. In my whole life, I had never made candy other than making taffy, vinegar taffy, a couple of times at somebody else's house, not even at my own house, so I really didn't even have a recipe. But I experimented and I started making candy. I was making over 500 bars of candy a day. Those were big bars, too. I got a great deal of help from Maria Arosa down at the Bureau of Plant Industry. I got help from some of my German and Swiss friends who, the Japanese at that time were rationing papers like glassine and wax paper and that kind of paper that you bought in reams. And I was only allowed 50 sheets a day, which wasn't enough, so I had 2 or 3 Swiss and German friends buying for me also. And I had a wonderful old Spanish friend, Pepe Gonzalez, who died recently in Oregon at the age of 99, who was an importer of essential oils and flavors. And he provided me with oil of peppermint, oil of cinnamon, oil of cloves, etc., maple extract. And I started making, as I say, making candy. My husband sold half of it in camp, and I sold the other half outside. I was very lucky. I was able to buy sugar through friends in Tabacalera. Now, let me explain that the Japanese did not allow anyone to hold more than 10 kilos of sugar, because if they did, they were going to be hung. That was it. Now, how can I make all this candy and only have 10 kilos of sugar? But Tabacalera provided it to me by the sack. And I put it in a carretella, and I came right down Taft Avenue, past the Japanese guards. And when we passed the Japanese guards, I would bow to them, and they would bow back. I guess they figured that no enemy alien, which obviously I was because I wore an armband that said so, would go down the road with all that sugar exposed. Maybe they figured it was sawdust for fuel. I don't know, but nobody ever stopped me. And I got my sugar supply that way. And that fed 8 of us. When I say 8 of us, it's my husband, my son, and I. That's 3. Our houseboy and his wife and their baby, that's 6. My gardener and my lavandera, that makes 8. It fed them, it fed us. I gave them their salaries every month and was able to save money. And every cent extra and over above that I got, I bought canned goods. I bought canned meats like corned beef and chipped beef, canned salmon. I bought powdered milk. I bought vitamin tablets. I bought calcium tablets, etc., etc. And I stocked them because I figured that who knows what's going to happen. So I kept stocking up on these foods. Eventually, the Japanese, as they said, as long as we are victorious, we can afford to be magnanimous. And they allowed us to stay, and they didn't bother us. But eventually, of course, the Americans started their way back, and the Japanese then pulled us all back in, including all the missionaries that they had left out, and the nuns and the priests. So I had to go back, and this time I went back with my son, because they would no longer allow me to leave him outside. Nor did I want to, because if a battle was going to be fought, I wanted him with me. So 1 year after I got out, I was back in the camp again. From then on, things went downhill very, very rapidly. There were classes being held in camp. The children were being schooled. But toward the end, even that stopped because the children just plain didn't have the energy to even think. They were hungry, and they were all anybody thought about was food. Food, 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 food. We'd go to have roll call, and people would sit and talk about the meals that they were going to eat when they got outside. And in my little group, my area, each day somebody was appointed host or hostess, and they would tell all the others in their group what they were serving for dinner. It was the darndest thing. You'd say, well, I'm going to have a big baked ham, and there'll be pineapple slices and candied sweet potatoes, and somebody'd say, and don't forget a very large platter of just plain old mashed potatoes. How about gravy? You know, everybody, and what are you having for dessert? Food, food, food. People were writing recipes on any scrap of paper they could find. People dreamt about food, talked about food. As I mentioned earlier, I stocked up heavily on food. When the Japanese told me to come back into camp, they told me I could only bring what I could carry. Well, I came in with a 2-ton truck. And strangely enough, they let it in. It's like I said, I was lucky all down the line. They let my stuff in, and I had that truck. I had a great big 80-gallon water container with a faucet at the bottom. I had a whole barrel of cocoa. I had all my canned goods. I had a big aparador. I had a bed for the little boy. I had a table. You name it, I had it. I even had orchids hanging on so that I could hang them on my shack, because my husband had built a small shack while I was out. It was 9 feet by 11 feet. It was made all of bamboo and nipa. There was not a nail in the construction. It was all tied together with bihuku and pegged, and it was a very sturdy little shack. My husband was not a carpenter at all, but he sure learned how to be one in a hurry. In fact, he even made a rocking chair for the little boy, and his only tool for that was a penknife. He didn't even, everything was pegged. No hammer, no saw, just a penknife. As I was saying, things began to go downhill from then on, and it wasn't only that things were difficult to get into camp, but the country itself was beginning to get hungry. The Japanese were beginning to get hungry. The Filipinos outside were beginning to get hungry. So food became more difficult. The Japanese had allowed a few Filipinos to come in every day and brought vegetables and fruit and a few other such things in to us, and those of us who had money could buy. However, not everybody had money, but the supply was short. Meat was available 2 or 3 days a week, and they didn't ration it. You could buy whatever you wanted to buy, what was available, provided you were in line early enough. So my sister stood in line from 5 to 6. Her girlfriend stood in line from 6 to 7, took over from my sister. And from 7 to 8, I stood in line and then bought the meat. And I bought more than we needed. I took it home and I dried it. I made jerky. I put salt, pepper, and garlic on it. And I had a piece of galvanized iron, which I put up on the roof, on our thatched Nipa roof. And I dried it up there for a day or two, and then I strung it on wires and hung it from a little laundry line I had. And they looked like bats. My neighbors around there teased me about it, called me the Bat Woman. And I told them, don't tease me and don't laugh at me. You go and do likewise while the meat's still available. So they did. But they ate it as fast as they made it instead of keeping it. Another thing we did was to keep, well, we planted. We had a garden. The Japanese allowed each of us to have a small plot of ground if we wanted it. This was the first thing I did. We planted papaya trees because they said, this is the plot. Not when I say they, not the Japanese, but our own committee said, we will give you this plot of land to plant. Eventually, the camp garden may have to take it over, and if and when they do, we will allow you to harvest what's on it before we take it away from you. However, I planted, as I say, papayas around the outside of my little plot because I figured that way, if I can continue to harvest what's in it, the papayas will go on for 3 or 4 years. There's no problem. But I actually lost friends because they said that, they said, how can that, you even suggest that we'll be in here for another 10 months, which is what it takes for papaya to grow and produce fruit. They got very angry with me. That was terrible. During that year that I was outside, for example, when I made candy, I made some special ones for Christmas. And when I asked my husband to see if he could take orders for it, they got angry with him for suggesting, that was in October, for suggesting that we might still be in there Christmas of 42. People got very angry because there was this constant feeling among many of them that we're all going to be out in 2 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. And because of that, many of them ate up their supplies and used up their supplies. I was very stingy with our supplies, and I took great care not to use them up. And anything that was edible on the line, we ate, believe me. We might supplement it now and then, but we never disregarded completely what was on the line. We used that and supplemented it. So aside from having our garden, we also had 2 chickens. I don't remember who we got them from, but we swapped a can of corned beef for 1 chicken. A can of corned beef doesn't have to be fed every day like a chicken, so that's why we were able to get it. And we had these 2 chickens, which we had great difficulty feeding, and each of us spent over an hour a day getting food for it. I used to go and collect grass seeds, and when we found that the grass seeds were too small for the chickens to pick up with their beaks, I mixed it with rice water, poured it onto a pan, and let it harden like peanut brittle, and then would break it up and give it to the chickens to eat. We had to cut certain types of green grass, chop it up to give them. My husband dug worms because they needed protein. So we spent over an hour a day getting food for these 2 chickens so that our little boy could have an egg about 4 or 5 times a week. And at night, believe it or not, we put those chickens in a basket and put it under our mosquito net with us, because otherwise they'd be gone, they'd be stolen by morning.
All right. Action.
Okay. All sorts of things happened, of course, in Santo Tomas. Some of them were very Funny, some of them were very disheartening. Some of them made us very angry. Like the Japanese, for example, very often the Swiss and others, the neutrals outside, and not only neutrals, even the Germans and so on, would send things in. Like they sent in milk for the children. The Japanese would say they don't need it. They've got plenty, even if they didn't. Or they would let the milk sit out there in the hot sun until it turned sour before they let it in. This sort of thing was very disheartening, especially when you had a bunch of hungry children. Some funny things happened. Like the day that the little boy, aged about 10 or 12, something like that, rushed over to the hospital grounds. The hospital grounds were just outside the actual internment camp. They'd closed off a road and fenced it in, so you went across the street, but it seemed like part of the compound. But there was a Japanese guard, and the boy was in such a rush that he rushed right by the guard and didn't bow. Well, the Japanese guard shouted at him, made him come back, and made him bow. This made the little boy very angry. A lot of people took offense at having to bow. I didn't feel that way because every time I bowed to them, they had to bow back at me, and it was just a way of greeting. But this little boy got very angry. So that afternoon, he got about 15 or 20 of his buddies, and they kept marching over to the hospital and back out, and back in, and back out. And that Japanese guard spent the whole afternoon bowing from the waist. So for every bow that they made once, he had to make 20 times. They wore him out. You know, this sort of thing happened. We had, I mentioned, you know, a lot of people have asked me, well, what did you do all day? I mean, weren't you bored to tears? Well, there wasn't time to be bored. We all had our jobs to do. We all had work to do. Remember, everything was washed by hand. We had to stand in line to go to the toilet. We had to stand in line to brush our teeth. We had to stand in line to wash our face. We had to stand in line to stand under the shower with 5 or 6 other people. We had to stand in line for our meals, and if you had a child, you had to stand in line for the child's meal, which was separate. You had to stand in line if you wanted to buy vegetables while they were still available. You had to stand in line to get your 3 sheets of toilet paper per day. Well, that was one of the funny things that happened. I didn't know that they'd been issuing toilet paper. They'd been issuing it for some time, so I went and wanted to get my back issue, and they wouldn't give it to me. I created quite a fuss, but I never did get the toilet paper. But there were little things like that that happened. Now, in my family's case, see, my mother, my sister, my brother, and I, my husband, my son were all in there. My father was with the military, so he went through the death march and was in Cabanatuan. He was taken prisoner in Bataan. My brother had been taken by the Japanese right in the very beginning. They took him straight from the house to, actually he stayed at the Baby Hotel for the first couple of nights, if I'm not mistaken. And then they took him down to Hecox because they wanted him to go to work and put the radio station back into working condition. He eventually was taken out of camp and put in Fort Santiago, which was the military headquarters. Not for anything that he had done, actually, but because they found his name in the home of a man who had been listening to the radio and who they caught. And when he was interrogated, they had a Japanese interpreter that my brother had met before the war. The man had come and bought loudspeakers and other sound equipment from my brother. I've got a bee bothering me.
We'll read through that. But could you mention your brother's name?
Yeah.
I didn't. Yeah. I don't think we heard you said your brother. And
yeah, I did. Okay.
Maybe to identify Hornbach.
Hornbostel, Earl Hornbostel. Yeah. Okay.
Can you explain it? Okay. My brother, Earl Horn.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Okay. Action.
My brother, Earl Hornbostel, he was also taken out of camp by them and put in Fort Santiago. And while he was there, he was interrogated by a young Japanese that he had met before, who had bought loudspeakers and other sound equipment from him. It turned out later that this man, this Japanese interpreter, also had been the interpreter when Wainwright surrendered. He was also the interpreter when the Japanese surrendered. And although everybody thought he was Japanese and so on, he was actually an American spy, or whatever you want to call him, G2 intelligence man. And the reason that he had bought this equipment from my brother was actually to spy on the Japanese down in Davao, not to show the movies as he claimed that he was going to do as a living. So we also had our spies around, not just the Japanese. I would like to mention here too, I think the saddest part of the internment camp was the small children. They were underfed, undernourished, and toward the end, many of them just sat and stared into space. It's a very, very disheartening thing to have children who don't know how to play, who don't know how to laugh. There was one little boy whose father was in the army, and I remember his mother telling him just shortly after the Americans landed at Lingayen that soon his daddy would be here, and his daddy was going to bring him all sorts of wonderful things. He was going to bring him apples and oranges and real nice things like that. Well, unfortunately, this little child was too small to remember what an apple or an orange was. So it didn't mean a great deal to him. When he was told he was going to get an apple or an orange, he says, "But Mommy, will he bring me something soft to wipe my bottom with, too?" So, which was much more important, apparently, because he didn't know that apples and oranges were edible. And in that connection, I remember my own son. I don't know if I mentioned it earlier, but we had 2 chickens in camp. And we kept these chickens at night in a basket, which we took into bed with us so that they wouldn't be stolen. And when the first time that we had an egg to give him, I was pointing out to him, mind you, this is just a very small boy, and I was pointing out to him that this was the egg white and this is the yolk. And he said, what do you call it? I said, the yolk. Well, he remembered that long ago he used to get something for breakfast that tasted very good. And he looked at me and his eyes brightened up and he says, "Oh, Mommy, you think you can give me some yolk meal?" So it was very, very sad the way the children were treated or mistreated. And many of them, of course, suffered afterwards for years. My own son, although I was able to give him a little bit of milk every day, and although I gave him calcium lactate tablets every day, his teeth still suffered. Maybe by nature they would have been poor anyway, I don't know, but a dentist who saw him about 2 years after the war scolded me because he said that I had not fed the boy properly for a long time. So I explained to him about our internment by the Japanese. And to this day, my son has very poor teeth.
Anything else? Okay. Action.
Supposedly, the Japanese passed rules and regulations, of course, that we were supposed to abide by. One of them being no contact between the sexes, which was fine, and so on. It meant you couldn't walk around holding hands or anything like that. But then eventually, when the buildings got very, very crowded, they allowed the women to move out into the shanties with the men. And of course, what can you control then? But of course, not everybody had shanties, only a limited few. But it didn't stop entirely the increase in population. Some people had, a couple of women had 2 babies, and one of them even had 3 babies during the 3 years that we were in there. There were places to go. In the main building, there was a landing between the 2 floors, between the 3rd and 4th floor. We couldn't go beyond the 3rd floor, but a man had a landing up there that was curtained, and he rented that out. And out in one of the shanty towns, somebody had a piano crate that he rented out by the hour. Well, this sort of thing happened. It's just one of those things. You can't stop it. The Japanese at one time suggested, because many people complained, suggested putting up a big tent for the use of married couples. They could go in and use it. This had no cubby holes or anything like that. It was just one big tent. Of course, everybody laughed at the idea that you go in and make love in public. But quite a large number of children were born in camp, and they suffered very seriously from malnutritional problems. And then very often their mothers didn't have milk because the mothers were poorly nourished, and there was no milk for the babies. So it really was a very bad situation. Toward the end, you see, people were dying at the rate of 10, 12 people a day of starvation, which the Japanese, by the way, didn't want the doctors to call the deaths caused by starvation or malnutrition. If a person died of pneumonia because they were malnourished, it had to be pneumonia or heart failure or whatever, but they wouldn't allow us to put died of malnutrition or starvation on the death certificates.
And action.
When the American troops finally did come in, they came in at night. It was very exciting, believe me. I don't know what, if any time in my life again, I'll ever be as excited as I was that night. They came in, they all looked enormous. They all had chocolate bars and candies and goodness knows what. The only problem was that there were very few Americans. It was a quick drive into Manila to save us, and the internment camp was their perimeter line. They set up guns, and out where our garden was, which was in the southeast corner, out by where the university press is today, and was then too, they set up their guns there. And so the Japanese were firing on us. They say that they were firing on us from the PGH. I'm not sure. But we could hear the big shells going over us in both directions, sounding like freight trains. And of course they were using mortar shells on us. So there was no place to hide. You couldn't get in the lee side of the building because there was no lee side with mortars. But I went out early in the morning with my husband to check on our garden because I knew I had a few tomatoes ripening and I wanted to grab them quick. And we got out there, and it seems as though some Japanese shells had fallen into that part of the garden and unearthed many cases of good old Spanish brandy that the priests had buried there when the Japanese occupied Manila. And all the soldiers, the American soldiers out there, were falling down drunk. They hadn't had a drink for 3 years, and here they were drinking brandy. And they presented us with a few bottles of it. And by the way, I might add, there were also some cases with beautiful wine glasses and brandy glasses as well. When I came back 2 days later to check my tomatoes again, there was a whole brand new bunch of soldiers there. I asked what had happened to the first bunch. They told me they'd been transferred out, that they had been drinking on duty. But in the meantime, the soldiers who were there were all busy with spades. Instead of digging foxholes, they were digging brandy. It was a very, very funny situation. But, you know, a lot of that may have been funny and amusing, but at the same time, the Japanese shells were hitting the corner of the building, and quite a few internees were killed, maimed, you know, crippled, hurt. And one poor woman went completely out of her head because she was standing there watching when her daughter was decapitated by a piece of shrapnel. It was a very exciting but very, very terrible few days. And there was no place to hide from anything. We were walking down the path with our little boy, and we told him, now if you ever hear the shell coming from above, it sort of whistles in a sound that sounds like it's traveling in a corkscrew motion, you lie down in the ditch. But this little boy was 5 years old, and of course he wanted to know why, so I'm in the midst of trying to explain to him why when down comes one of these shells, and we weren't close enough to grab him, so we lay down in the ditch, and he just stood there and watched us and said, "You mean like that?" And there he stood, but a few feet away from us was a poor GI who was in a foxhole but had half his face shot away. The only thing my son remembers about the internment camp was something that happened during liberation. A GI took a whole bunch of children riding around the front circle in his Jeep, and one of the boys picked up his rifle and was fooling with it and pulled the trigger and shot this poor soldier right through the chest. Well, of course, you know, he was rushed to the hospital, and he did live. But my son stood there and watched him for a while bleeding and ran home and to tell us about it. But it took him about 5 minutes to be able to speak. He was so shocked. And I think that this is the only thing he remembers at all about Santo Tomas. He doesn't remember anything else. Things happened in there that, you know, things that he said and did that I would have thought he'd remember, but he didn't. He didn't remember at all. Just that. That's the only thing. You know, all along, people were saying we're going to be out in 2 weeks, but when, of course, the troops were really almost there, and we knew it, almost the point where we could hear it, where we could see the planes overhead already, and we could hear them, and we could hear the shooting going on. We had a man in there we called him the broker. He had a big exchange board up. Somebody wanted to exchange a kilo of sugar for a pound of powdered milk or whatever. And one day I passed by and I saw a sign there, and it said that somebody wanted to exchange a lipstick for a can of corned beef. And I said, what do they want? They want the lipstick or they want the corned beef? And they said, well, they want the lipstick. I said, they want a lipstick for a can of corned beef? They're crazy. But wait, hold it, I'll go get you a lipstick. Because when I went in that second time, and I had money to spend, I went around and I spent it on anything I could find. And among the things I bought was a box of 24 cashmere bouquet lipsticks that cost 15 centavos each. That's the cheapest of the cheap. I took it over, I got a can of corned beef. I said, leave the sign up, I've got more lipstick. And you know, I got a can of corned beef for every one of those lipsticks. All the gals wanted to look pretty for when the soldiers arrived. That was more important than food to them. And we were starving. It's unbelievable that people would do that, but they did it. And I was happy to be on the corned beef end of it. Well, I'm glad that all this happened to me while I was young and capable and strong and able. I wouldn't want to go through it again when I was young. And I hope that nobody ever again has to go through something of this nature, because it sure isn't a pleasant situation to be in, and especially not for young children.
Actually,
Yeah, I've been asked about the Larson, why Chris Larson was executed by the Japanese. The reason was that there were these three men who were on the committee that the Japanese, I don't recall exactly what happened, but I think they found radio parts or something in their shanties. And these three men were to be taken out and punished or whatever was going to happen. We didn't know at that time. But when they called them over the loudspeakers, they made a mistake because we had a Cliff Larson and a Chris Larson, and they called the wrong first name. So naturally, the young man went instead of the older man. The older man was a standard vacuum executive. I don't remember what or who the younger man worked for, but he had just gotten married to a young girl named Salmon. Her family name was Salmon. And he was the one that was taken out, and it was a mistake.